Pastor tried to auction the Virgin Mary's statue, but what happened next left them speechless. What started as one man's greedy mistake became a miracle that saved not just a church, but the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. $45,000. Do I hear 50? Pastor David stood at the front of St. Anne's Catholic Church, holding a wooden gavel like he was selling cars instead of leading worship. Behind him, under a bright spotlight, sat the statue that had watched over this community for 70 years, Our Lady of Sorrows, carved from wood and painted with love by hands long since returned to dust. The church looked wrong, all wrong. In the front pews sat strangers with money, art dealers from the city who talked about market value like they were buying groceries. They held little paddles with numbers, waiting to bid on something sacred, like it was just another antique. In the back, the real parishioners huddled together like refugees in their own church. Maria Santos, 83, and the grandmother of this place, cried quietly into a rosary. Her grandparents had carried that statue all the way from Mexico in 1952. It was the most precious thing they owned, and they'd given it to their new church, because that's what faith looked like. Giving your best to God, not selling it to the highest bidder. 50,000. The voice came from a man in an expensive suit who hadn't looked up from his phone once. Mr. Harrison, some art collector from New York who probably had 3 houses and 0 soul. Pastor David's heart jumped. 50,000. That would fix the roof, replace the old heater, and his mind wandered to selfish places, maybe leave enough for that car he'd been wanting. After all, a pastor needed reliable transportation, right? The bidding stopped. Nobody else was raising their paddle. Mr. Harrison looked bored, like he was buying a lamp at a garage sale instead of a holy statue that had answered prayers for decades. $50,000. Pastor David raised the gavel high. Going once, Maria's sob echoed through the church. Going twice, this was it. The moment all their money problems would be solved. The old folks would understand eventually. You couldn't run a church on feelings and memories. They needed heat in winter and a roof that didn't leak during storms. Pastor David lifted the gavel to its highest point, ready to bring it down. That's when he looked at Maria, really looked at her. She wasn't angry. She was heartbroken, looking at him like a grandmother watching her grandson sell her wedding ring for drug money, like someone whose faith was being auctioned off by the very person meant to protect it. For the first time in months, Pastor David saw what he was really doing. He was standing in God's house, selling off the heart of his community to strangers who would lock it away where no one could ever pray before it again. His smile died. The gavel shook in his hand. God, what have I done? The prayer came from somewhere deeper than his head. Please forgive me. Stop this. Then something impossible happened. A rose petal fell from the statue's eye, not like someone had dropped it from above. It came from the painted wood itself, like a tear made real. Deep red, perfect, falling slow as a feather. Then another petal, and another. Pastor David's hand froze. The gavel hung in the air like time had stopped. More petals began falling. A soft rain of fresh roses from both of the statue's eyes, pooling at her feet like she was crying flowers. The whole church went silent. Even Mr. Harrison looked up from his phone, his mouth hanging open. The smell of roses filled the air, not fake perfume, but the real thing, like walking through a garden after morning rain. Pastor David stared at the weeping statue. The gavel fell from his hand, hitting the floor like a gunshot in the silence. "The auction is cancelled," he said into the microphone, his voice cracking. Mr. Harrison jumped up. "Wait a minute. I have a binding." "Our Lady is not for sale," Pastor David said, louder now. "She was never for sale. She belongs here, with her people." He turned to face the congregation, finding Maria's eyes in the back. "She's not something to buy and sell. She's a gift from God." And I almost threw that away for money. Maria stood up slowly, her old bones creaking. She walked down the aisle while rose petals kept falling like snow. When she reached the front, she bent down and picked up one of the impossible flowers. It was warm in her fingers, like it had just been touched by sunlight. She climbed the steps and placed the petal in Pastor David's open hand. "Mijo," she said softly, "everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do when God opens your eyes." The other parishioners moved forward, drawn by something they couldn't explain. They knelt around the statue, gathering the miraculous petals, whispering prayers and crying happy tears. Even some of the bidders came closer, their greedy plans forgotten in the face of something that couldn't be bought or explained. Mr. Harrison stomped out, talking about lawyers and contracts, but nobody cared. The other dealers followed him, shaking their heads. They'd come for treasure they could own, but ran from a miracle they couldn't understand. Pastor David knelt beside the statue, his knees in the soft pile of rose petals. He looked up at Our Lady's face, the same carved features that had watched over this church for 70 years, but somehow different now. More real, more alive. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I almost sold you like you were nothing. Like your love meant nothing." The petals kept falling, gentle as rain. That night, Pastor David called an emergency meeting. Word had already spread through the neighborhood about what happened. People came who hadn't been to church in years, drawn by a story too strange to ignore. The sanctuary was packed. The statue sat in her usual place, surrounded by hundreds of rose petals that refused to wilt or fade. They smelled as fresh as the moment they'd fallen. Pastor David stood behind the pulpit, the same spot where he'd tried to auction away their faith just hours before. "This morning I stood here as a salesman," he began. "I thought I could solve our problems by selling off what makes us who we are. I was wrong." He looked out at the faces, young and old, rich and poor. Some he recognized and some he didn't. Our roof still leaks. Our heater still needs fixing. But Our Lady reminded me today that a church isn't a building. It's a family. And families don't sell their mothers to pay the bills. Maria nodded from the front row, a rose petal pressed between the pages of her prayer book. "So here's what we're going to do," Pastor David continued. "We're going to fix this place the right way, together. Every dollar we raise, every hour we volunteer, every prayer we pray, it all goes toward making this church a home again." The response was immediate. Mr. Garcia offered his roofing skills for free. Mrs. Kim promised bake sales every weekend until they raised what they needed. The teenagers volunteered to help with yard work and cleaning. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. A woman in the back row stood up. She was well dressed, clearly from money, but her face was soft with wonder. "I came here today as a buyer," she said. "I collect religious art. But what I saw, what happened to that statue? I've never seen anything like it." She reached into her purse and pulled out a check. "I'd like to make a donation. Not to buy anything, but to help preserve what can't be bought." The check was for $50,000, the same amount Mr. Harrison had offered. Pastor David stared at the number, amazed. "Mum, we can't accept." "You can, and you will," she said firmly. "Some things are priceless, but that doesn't mean we can't help protect them." Over the following weeks, more donations came. The story of the weeping statue had spread beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city. People drove from hundreds of miles away just to see the rose petals that wouldn't die, to pray before Our Lady, who had wept flowers. But Pastor David was careful. No cameras were allowed, no interviews with reporters, no turning their miracle into a circus. "This isn't about us," he told Maria one afternoon as they arranged fresh roses in a vase at the statue's feet. It's about her, and she's not a tourist attraction. Maria smiled, her weathered hands gentle with the flowers. You learned, mijo. That's what matters. The church was fixed within 6 months. New roof, new heater, fresh paint throughout. But more than the building was restored, the congregation grew not because of the miracle, but because of what the miracle had taught them about love, sacrifice, and keeping faith with what truly matters. A year later, on the anniversary of the failed auction, Pastor David stood in the same spot where he'd once held a gavel like a weapon. This time, he held a single red rose. 12 months ago, I tried to sell Our Lady because I thought money could solve our problems, he said to the packed sanctuary. Instead, she solved our real problem. She reminded us that some things can't be bought or sold, only loved and cherished. He placed the rose at the statue's feet, where hundreds of miraculous petals still lay fresh as the day they'd fallen. A church isn't a business, it's a family. And Our Lady taught us that when family stands together, miracles happen. Maria, now 84 and still in the front row, wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that smelled like roses. Her grandparents' gift to this church had become something greater than they'd ever imagined. Not just a statue, but a reminder that love given freely always comes back, multiplied. After the service, children played in the rose garden that now bloomed behind the church. Families shared meals in the fellowship hall. Teenagers helped elderly members down the front steps. Pastor David locked up that evening, the last one to leave as always. He stopped by the statue for his nightly prayer, as had become his habit. Thank you, he whispered, for stopping me when I lost my way, for showing me that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold. The statue stood silent in the dim light, but Pastor David could swear he smelled roses on the evening air. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. The church sat solid and peaceful, its roof sound, its heart restored. And inside, Our Lady of Sorrows kept her eternal watch, no longer threatened by greed, but protected by a community that had learned the difference between what costs money and what's truly priceless. The rose petals never faded. Even today, visitors can see them at the base of the statue, hundreds of perfect flowers that fell like tears when a mother watched her son almost sell his soul for silver. They remain fresh and fragrant, a daily reminder that miracles don't just happen once. They happen every time someone chooses love over money, faith over fear, and the sacred over the profitable. In the small vase that sits permanently at Our Lady's feet, there's always a single red rose, replaced each morning by whoever arrives first at church. It's become a tradition, a prayer without words, a way of saying thank you to the mother who wept flowers to save her children from their own worst impulses. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the last prayer has been said and the last light dimmed, if you listen carefully, you can still smell roses blooming in the darkness, the scent of divine love stronger than human greed, of miracles that happen when sacred things are kept sacred, and of a community that learned the most important lesson of all. Some things are worth more than money. Some things are worth everything.